Welcome, everyone. My name is Barrie Friedland, and I'm here with Jacob Kravetz. We are co-founders of Don't Shop on Tuesday, and this is another going to be fascinating chat. We are talking to Ronda Cooperstein, and she's dedicated her life to books and learning and art and contribution, but she's here today as co-chair of Baltimore Peace Action. And she's spent the many decades, she told us 47 years, studying US policy as it affects Israel, and of course, how that impacts on the Mideast. And so we're going to have a calm, informative, and very important discussion today because it just seems that we can't have it. Any questions that are raised, people are called anti-Semitic, elected officials could be primaried, or people could be threatened with deportation. So it's important to calmly look at the decisions that were made and how it impacts. So Rhonda, thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, and I'll start out giving a little background about myself. I was born and raised in Baltimore. I went to Hebrew school, but we weren't raised in a particularly Zionist type of situation. And I was very curious about global issues at a pretty young age. And when I went to college, my first year in college, I came upon a book by the father of Yehuda Menuhin, the famous violinist. His name was Moshe Menuhin. And he had written a book called The Decadence of Judaism in Our Time. And what it was published in, I think, 1969 by the Journal of Palestine Studies. And it was a record of all the trips he and other Jewish people made to the United Nations to try and urge them to bring the Palestinians who had been driven into exile back to their homes, that the exile should not have been permanent, that there should be a binational state, Palestinians should return to their homes, and they would have to work out a way to live together. But of course, we know on the other side of the coin, in the Jewish community primarily, very influential people did not want that. You know, they wanted Israel to become a Jewish state and not the binational state that people like Martin Buber had envisioned. I guess everybody knows the famous theologian and philosopher Martin Buber. So little by little, all of the legitimacy of Jewish concern for what had happened was destroyed by the very pro-Zionist elements in our society. And I think, given the trauma of the Holocaust and the feelings people had about safety and protection, that they became enthralled by this idea of Zionism, a Jewish ethno-state. Whereas, and like I said, other Jewish people in the community were not so enthralled with that idea, but they've been long since pushed aside.
You know, I just like to make it clear that a lot of terms get conflated, and different religions actually live in Israel. It is not 100% Jewish. And Zionists don't have to be Jewish. There are plenty of Zionists that are not Jewish and could very well be anti-Semitic at the same time.
Exactly.
And most Jews don't live in Israel. They live the rest of the world. So all of this gets conflated, and we have to be very clear. Thank you for your very erudite references, but we have to be very clear about the most basic concepts that I would say Huckabee, who is the ambassador to Israel, is a Zionist.
Oh yeah.
Christian Zionists are an extremely powerful force and dangerous force in this country.
Zionism.
Well,
the actual origins of Zionism are Christian. There's actually a lot of books out about that. Zionism was a Christian invention. You might not realize that, but if you look it up, you'll find that back in the 1800s, there was this very evangelical Christian movement that even before, maybe the 1700s, I'm not sure, that thought the Jews should be gathered and sent to Palestine. So it's actually a lot of Christians involved. But when I talk about
that is because, right, that's because they believe that that will help bring about
exactly,
the end
yes,
times and the
exactly,
cataclysm. It's
exactly.
not for
No,
Jewish people's
no. It was,
well-being. In fact,
yes,
in
no,
their belief system, most of those people die afterwards
exactly.
as a result of this.
I think all the
But
Jews die in that scenario.
but speaking in the early years of the idea of Zionism, there was the binational idea where it would be a shared community with whoever lived there. The Jews would live there and every other national identity, and since it was primarily Arab, it was binational. But that just didn't happen because it's fairly, once people get power, it often goes to the least deserving of that power. So, the more radical elements took took
So
took
what
the
years,
reins.
Rhonda? What years are we talking about right now during
Talking
this
about
period where the
post 48 and
up
during the
through
50s, during the
during the 50s?
50s, when there were lobbying was going on in the UN all the time about having the Palestinians come back to their homes. So that's the period I'm talking about.
But that was colored by the recent memories of what happened in Europe.
Exactly. That's why the Jews were so vigilant and determined. But there always were Jews who were uncomfortable with the way things were playing out. An example of that is a Rabbi Elmer Berger, a New York rabbi who was a very esteemed rabbi, and he created an organization. He got very upset by the direction Zionism was taking, and he created an organization called American Jews Against Zionism. And he had a lot of good relationships with Palestinians and Arabs, and he wanted the idea of Zionism to not be the fate of what happened in the Middle East in terms of one ethnic group dominating another and just, divesting the other community of its equal rights. So he fought long and hard, but he wasn't popular. So that's basically I'm talking about up through, this is pre-1980, all of this.
It's been such a long, I make a very unfunny joke that let's take everyone out of Israel, like rope it off. And if you say it's sacred, that's fine. And then put people other places. I mean, it just, to fight over land is so incredibly tragic and sad.
And we also can't ignore the idea of resources. There are limited resources in a place like that. And years ago, the demographers said that in that land of historic Palestine, between 3 and 5 million could comfortably live. Well, now what are there, close to, except for so many Palestinians are being killed now, but there are now like what, 18 million living there now. Is it, I think 10 million within Israel, and then in the occupied lands, probably maybe a little less. But anyway, so there's a lot of problems with resources. If you're not going to share the resources, if you want to have this high-tech society and you're living in a desert or a place where there's limited land and resources, you can't have everything. And if you want to have everything, you're going to have to take it from someone else. And that's basically what's been happening over the years. And it's actually not that uncommon across the globe. It's just that we hear so much about this. I'm a part of a group called Survival International, which is a group that tracks indigenous people across the globe and their fate, which is to be often driven off their land in order to make way for what so-called progress, or for whoever is wants to control whatever resources are in that area. So what we have is basically, when we look at Israel and Palestine, we're looking at a mini picture of the globe itself, of human society and the way things have been functioning in this type of civilization that's based on extraction and growth. So there's a lot that goes into that. That this is part of that.
So why and when did in this, what was America in general? Obviously, you mentioned the American Jewish rabbi that was an anti-Zionist and was advocating for this binational state. What was America's general cultural and political sort of stance and position? Was there a strong one? And sort of when did this morph into such an incredibly tightly bound set of sort of political fates, and the complete, which is now breaking down, but for multiple decades, the sort of complete wedding, of support from both sides of the aisle, where they fight about many things, but there's a complete totemic support of the, of Israel and policies.
I think there was just a lot of suppression and bullying. For example, you have someone, and a lot of, if you don't really delve deep, you just get a more superficial understanding. For example, Isaac Bashevis Singer, he went to Israel and he was very disillusioned. And he had a lot of concerns about it, but we don't hear about that. Isaac, the great writer, you know who I'm talking about, Isaac Bashevis Singer, the great
Yes.
Jewish writer. Yes. You have other people who were starting to ask questions, and a lot of those questions were suppressed. There was a book I read, The Goats of Ein Gedi, years ago, by a rabbi who had been in Israel when it came into being, and he went back in the late 50s, and he was very disappointed because he had hoped for a binational nation, and what he found was a nation that was exclusively being tailored for the Jewish people and at the exclusion of the Arabs. And you also had, and I don't know if people realize this, but in the early days of Zionism, Yiddish was outlawed. Yiddish was suppressed. You weren't allowed to speak Yiddish. Theaters were burned by the early Zionists because they wanted to wipe out the memory of what happened in Europe. And it was a very, very traumatic time for the Jewish people. And it played out in all kinds of ways.
I say you can't discuss politics without knowing Yiddish, but that's a story for another day. I think part of the problem, I mean, first of all, Jews became an extremely powerful force in terms of lobbying and power, and I'm a political strategist. As a group, they vote, and they vote in very large numbers. But I think all of this was under the soft tissue perspective of the Jews need a safe place. If Germany wasn't safe, if they couldn't survive in a country like Germany, where can they go to be safe? And I think this affected literally almost all the perception and a lot of the policy, but it flipped, and now the Jews are the ones that are creating war crimes. and just taking horrific action.
Yeah, and I think that's actually, in psychology, you always have, you go and look at the person who becomes this horrible, criminal who's doing terrible things, and then you delve into their background and find out there was all this abuse and they were, mistreated. And, one of the things I know about in Jewish history was, Jewish men were always looked down upon as being weak and, not unwarlike and too passive. And so the Zionists wanted to erase that memory of Jewish people and replace it with a more masculine, macho image, which they've succeeded in doing, but to the detriment of a lot of people. So then we get, we move on. There was the
Well, during the 1950s, right, simultaneously, while this sort of argument is happening, we also have the United States. Partly why I was wondering is that, during the same period, right, we have uh, you have the United States help orchestrate a coup within Iran, right,
exactly
toppling the
1950s.
secular
Yep.
government in that area, right, and causing to some extent this large scale, revolt into and regression into sort of or transmutation into like a very religious ethno state there as well, and um, which likely cannot have been good for the security of Israel and for the Jewish people to take a secular nation and bring it into a antagonistic religious much larger nation neighboring. And so you know how does that was the United States, from what you've seen, like does this play a part in terms of how they're thinking about it? Is it completely they don't even care, they have nothing to do with each other, or and it's sort of bumbling along, just being like, oh, we broke it and now we're dealing with this new catastrophe, and
I think you mean in the 1950s?
yeah, I'm
Yeah,
just trying to sort
the
of
US
trace
was
how the
going
choices
around
that were
in the
made.
1950s and 60s was the post-colonial era, and the United States went around the globe and overthrew a lot of uh, elected leaders like Patrice Lumumba. I don't know if you remember him in the Congo. He was, and look
Mm.
at the DRC now, look at the Congo now. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. I mean, there's any number of coups that the US initiated, all because of their rivalry with the USSR. And Israel and a lot of the countries in the Middle East were allied with, sort of a national socialism type of government ideology. Yes, and there was rage against the Israelis, and that was fairly unified with Gamal Abdel Nasser and um and the leaders in Syria. And so there was legitimate concern from Israel that they needed full support from the United States, and they lobbied hard and very hard, and they because, as you said, they vote, they poured their money and their hearts and souls into lobbying for Israel, and little by little it became a reality where the United States would just support Israel no matter what.
Look at us, we're not even out of the 50s and 60s. and and it's just deja vu. I mean, we keep on having the same problems or similar problems over and over and over again. And
Well, that's mhm.
do you see a parallel between the leader of Israel today and the leader of the United States today?
um yes, of course. I mean, although Netanyahu is a lot clever. He's smarter than Donald Trump.
So's my cat Toby, but go ahead.
But oh yeah. But yes, they're authoritarian. They'll do anything, they'll say anything and do anything to keep power. And Netanyahu is in many ways a criminal. I mean, even within Israel, he's on trial for all kinds of crimes. Speaking of cats. So
In fact, well, he has a large amount, writing to zoom to the current day for a moment. He has a large amount of incentive to want to keep these conflicts and the violence going in an effort to keep his coalition together to avoid being criminally prosecuted and held accountable for the crimes that he has committed, that he's been held on trial for.
and
So
that
there's some perverse incentives there, that we're seeing played out.
And you look at leaders like Pinochet in Chile and Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe who got power and they never wanted to let it go. And whatever it took, they were going to keep their power. And Netanyahu is an example of that. However, Israel is viewed supposedly as, a democratic country and aligns itself with Europe. But in reality, and of course there's a lot to be criticize Europe for too. But in reality, it's very much like an authoritarian rule now. Democracy is being whittled away, and you have a very messianic element in Israel too, and that's very hard to deal with. I would call them the Jewish Taliban. They're
They've been
instead.
attacking attempting to undermine the court systems, attempting, and obviously there hasn't been a non-extreme right-wing coalition that's managed to be formed in quite a while now, unfortunately, as well.
Yeah.
Sorry to bring you all to the present, and because we were back in the 50s, and this is more philosophical. The minute that you can be proud of your heritage, you can be proud of your country, but the minute that any person or group is deemed less than, that's tragedy and that's war. That if you don't view everyone with respect and honor, which is not to say that some people don't commit crimes, but to bring it back to the parallel today, people are being deported based on a group designation, and things are happening in Israel based on a group designation, and we need, as a people, we just need to honor all groups until a person does something wrong, and then we deal with it individually.
And that's why, for years, our motto, I helped found one of the first Jewish and Palestinian joint peace groups in the area in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And, simple motto, equal rights for Palestinians, equal rights. That embraces everything. But, I have to say that we had in the 80s and 90s, we had a lot of support in our community for Palestinian rights. And we had speakers, we had, and I align myself with there is an opposition in Israel. Let's not forget that when you talk about Israel, let's talk about the Israeli government and the Israelis who support what's going on. Let's not forget that there's the Jewish Center for Nonviolence, there's B'Tselem, there's Yesh Givul, there's a Land for All, there's Standing Together. I mean, there's multiple groups in Israel that beg us for their support. But when we try to bring that to our community now, we are disavowed. I'll give you an example. In Baltimore this past year, are you familiar with Standing Together?
Mm-hmm.
Standing Together is a joint Israeli and Palestinian organization, and we were able to get them to come to one of the synagogues, Baltimore Hebrew congregation. Well, the Baltimore Zionist district, which is extremely right-wing, extremely hostile, and very much bullying, um, were outraged, and they tried to get everything canceled. They weren't successful, but they actually called Baltimore Hebrew Congregation, which is a huge, well-respected Reform congregation. They wrote an article calling it Baltimore Hamas Congregation. That's the level that we have reached, where a Jewish congregation is not allowed to have peacemakers come. That's really sad. I'm very appalled at uh, a lot of members of the Jewish community in Baltimore. And I'm sure that's how a lot of people feel across the country, because they're afraid to take a stand, and they allow themselves to be bullied. So even if they're not comfortable with what's going on, and I spoke to a former professor of mine recently about that. He's a Middle East scholar. He's very uncomfortable with what's going on, and he's not part of it, and he he's very upset about it. But he's mildly made some expressions to his congregation, but he hasn't pushed the issue, because people are so inside the Jewish community, there's just they come out in droves to go against us when we speak out. And these are other Jews. I'm talking about the Jewish community. They'll call according to them, I'm an anti-Semite. Which is, it's all nonsense. It doesn't make sense. Things don't make sense, just like a lot of what Donald Trump says doesn't make any sense. This whole conflation of anti-Semitism and criticizing Israel makes no logical sense whatsoever.
and
And
is in fact extremely dangerous and overall for the Jewish people, and is actually leading to a rise in real anti-Semitism. And is we can see that there has been rises, increases in both anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim, or just generally xenophobic behavior, throughout this. And I think it's, at least I would argue at this point, that the actions of the Israeli government are some of the most dangerous for general Jewish people across the globe, in terms of their general sort of safety, in terms of eroding the goodwill and sympathy that people had for the Jewish people over the atrocities that were committed against them in World War II and the Holocaust, and everyone failing to act then. Um, but we're now in a situation where many people, we're losing the remaining members of the of living survivors of the Holocaust to old age, and what is replacing it is a current memory of Israeli government claiming to speak on behalf of all global Jews, acting in extremely aggressive and barbaric way. um you know it's horrifying,
there's
and it's dangerous.
Yes, and I have to say that years ago, this was what Jewish people like me, who were active in this issue for years, we warned of this. We warned all the time, because there was always that right-wing element. There were always the Kahanists. Remember Meir Kahane? Do you remember him?
Mhm.
Yeah, from the JDL, the Jewish Defense League. He was a very right wing. He said we don't need a democracy, we need a theocracy. And he had his own followers, and there were more and more promotion of violence toward Arabs and Palestinians. And we warned that if you let this get out of control, it's going to turn into a nightmare. The so-called Jewish dream will become the Jewish nightmare. And, it is turning into a nightmare for a lot of Jewish people who are morally um, bound to universal principles. We can't allow, this to go on day in and day out in our name. And if that means, dramatically denouncing what Israel's doing, we have to do it. It has to be done. We can't say, well, blah, blah, blah. No, we have to stand up. And that's what a lot of Jewish people are doing. And they won't back down.
Most of the world views Netanyahu as a war criminal, probably because he's committing war crimes. And it is painful to watch what is the suffering that is going on. And I won't even get into the conspiracy theories here about how Israel didn't realize that there would be the attack on October 7th somehow. And what Netanyahu has done in the past to secure his position, his strange bedfellows and allies. But right now, what is clear is that he has been designated a war criminal, and he can't leave Israel and go to most countries.
And he is a war criminal, and so and a lot of his cabinet are war criminals. And just as recently as a couple weeks ago, 41 officers in the IDF sent a letter that they will not serve in Gaza anymore because it's a war, because war crimes are being committed. You had Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister, saying that this is turning into a war of extermination. Ehud Olmert said that. You have the other, what's his name? Yigal Golan, I forget, another opposition leader, saying that the IDF is, he literally said this, the IDF is killing babies for a hobby, as a hobby. I mean, he said it in a very heated moment, but these are people who are in the top echelons in Israeli society saying this. And it's not getting the attention it needs at all in the mainstream media here. It's not getting covered, the way it should. 1,500 Israeli academics a couple weeks ago wrote an open letter saying, the country is in a state of moral collapse. Action has to be taken. Tough love. We've got to do something. They've got to stop arming, sending them weapons. They've got to force them to do what's right, because they're not going to do it on their own. And it's a global responsibility. Letting Netanyahu run amok for all these years, and his right-wing messianic settlers tormenting Palestinians, burning their villages, driving them out of their homes. Of course they're going to be angry and violent. Treating them so badly. I mean, of course they're going to respond with violence. That's what they've been treated with for all these years. And amazingly enough, though, there still are a lot of nonviolent, I'd say many nonviolent Palestinians in Palestine. They work with Torah Tzedek, which is the organization of Rabbi Eric Asherman. Are you familiar with Eric Asherman?
No.
Okay, Rabbi Eric Asherman, who you should probably have on your show, is a rabbi who for years has worked in the West Bank, helping to protect Palestinians from settlers. He has an organization called Torah Tzedek, and that means Torah of justice. And his life has been threatened. He's been jailed, he's been beaten, everything, but he works with Palestinian villagers, and they invite him into their homes. They welcome him. They're not against him. They're not against Jews. They're against the Jewish people in uniforms, or the settlers who are coming after them. That's what their life has been. So, I mean, and I'm not going to deny, of course, there is anti-Semitism, But if you're a Palestinian and the only face you've ever seen is a Jewish settler and a soldier protecting the settler who's doing something illegal instead of protecting you, then that's what you're going to see Jewish people as, because they
Incredibly tragic. Just yeah. Well, I'm wondering. So we now, Netanyahu has been in power in one form or another for around 30 years, I believe, since 1995 is when he first entered Jewish politics in a major way. And during that time, we've seen, as you were saying, sort of an extreme rightward and messianic trend in Israel. And for a long time, it seemed that the United States was going in complete lockstep with them.
They did.
They have now, but I'm saying both sides. All the basically all the center of sort of political conversation. We are now seeing maybe at least a fracture within the Democratic Party over over Israel's behavior and the support of Israel. And so I'm wondering, we're now witnessing, as you were saying, so a war of extermination. Some call it a genocide, or and in Palestine that is ongoing, and in Gaza, and then we have the attempts at a war in Iran. And both of these, the time scales that they're working on in order to make real impact, before we more irreversible choices are made, right? What can be done, and where do you think you see sort of possibility, as an American Jew, or just as someone who cares, for the possibility of creating the space to really shift how the U.S. is acting, in this space, because Israel cannot continue to act this way without the support of the United States. And so this is a scenario where the politics in the United States can have very real, domestic politics in the United States can have very real consequences internationally, and with very high stakes. And so what do you think are the what gives you hope for action for the future? Where should we be looking?
Well, we have to keep lobbying our politicians day in and day out. So, for example, here we have our new Congress member, Johnny Olszewski, who is representing Baltimore, and he is on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he has not signed on to the resolutions for getting the immediate food and medical aid to Gazans. And so we're going to his office all the time, and he hasn't signed on to ending the offensive weapons. So we're at his office. We do that. We reach out to people in the community, and we, talk to people. I can't tell you how many people in the Jewish community have changed so much from this. Their view of Israel is not what it was. And, people are dismayed. And there are a lot of Jews in the Baltimore community. While we have a huge Orthodox community and a very right-wing element, and so many people talk to me. I have signs in my window that say negotiation, not annihilation, peace now, let Gaza live. And an Orthodox man, and I live in a very Jewish community, and an Orthodox man came to me the other day and he said, "You're right, So there are inroads in that way. Unfortunately, in the world of real politics, most things change out of a necessity. So, Israel's gotten beaten up pretty badly with it, after it bombed Iran. I mean, I don't know if you followed, but Israel's a pretty messed up place right now from all the bombs that Iran dropped on it. Have you followed that?
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's been a little bit difficult to get some, because there's been a lot of suppression around that
There's
they don't want people. But I heard some analysis that potentially the reason why Bibi Netanyahu took, has semi accepted this ceasefire is to give, sort of Israel a face-saving way to regroup, restock, and repair, in order before they launch another set of
well,
attacks.
well, that's what we have to really, you know, the United Nations has failed. I mean, everything's failed because the United States just blocks everything. And some of that is we have to remember that the United States spends more on its military than all the other countries in the world combined, I think. We have a huge, so aside from the lobbyists for Israel, and there's going to be a huge Christians United for Israel at Gaylord in the national park in, I guess, Prince George's County, and people will be there protesting. You've got millions of Christian Zionists who are lobbying day in and day out for Israel. You have the military and the lobbyists for the military, we'll call it the military industrial complex. War is profitable. And, a lot of money has been made on the war in Ukraine. A lot of money's made on the war in Palestine and Israel. Money's made from these weapons. And then there's also the aspect of the new technology using certain populations to test the technology, all the AI and all the drones, and things are just, warfare is just exploding in the
You know, you know,
technological age. And
Ja-
we have to get a grip on that.
Jacob actually made that point in our weekly email that he wrote about the financial advantages to certain people about war. And Rhonda, first of all, we're going to have you back 50 million times because we just scratched the surface on a very, very complex, decades-long issue. But we always end with something positive. You reference Baltimore a lot, and we all live here, although we have supporters throughout the country and in Canada and in Europe. So what is happening in Baltimore is very emblematic of what is happening throughout the world in terms of looking at the situation in the Mid East and trying to find the right solutions and to cut through the propaganda and find solutions. So, I mean, thank you. I mean, just take Baltimore and explode it. And that is what is happening everywhere. We thank you so much for your time, for your expertise. This is a very complicated subject that has been deliberately lied about and propagandized about. So we need to continue to have these conversations. Thank you for coming on. We will send this out probably this week. And there'll be links to organizations and groups that you support. So on
Okay.
behalf of all three of us, thank you so much, and don't shop on Tuesday.
Thank you. I'm a non-shopper.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone.